Hi, and welcome to this installment of the video introductions for the book, The Immersive World's Handbook. And this is Chapter 8, and it focuses on loyalty, tradition, change, and the future. And obviously by its title and subject, you can see this is the last chapter of the text. So this kind of sums up everything we've been talking about in the previous chapters. We first will talk about effective ways of creating loyalty within a space, transition into the idea of tradition and how it's important in your themed or immersive space. Talk about the difficult issue of change and how you can deal with change given the context of your design and ongoing design challenges. And the types of stories. We'll consider the types of stories that might be told in some of the design spaces of the future. So I begin with the idea of loyalty, and like a lot of the examples in this book, I use my own experiences working at Astroworld. When I was a trainer at Six Flags Astroworld, I really found that this became much more than a job to me. It really became an opportunity to connect with people, connect with guests, connect with fellow workers, and many of these people I knew back then in the 90s, I still am in touch with on social networking sites. And so I use this example to talk about the notion of loyalty, and suggest that loyalty is one of the most important things you can do in any space, is to create a space as organically as possible such that the guests will want to come back again and again. And my example would be when I worked at Astroworld, there was a guy we lovingly called, nicknamed Flumy, and he had ridden one of the Flume rides, I don't know, it seemed like 10,000 times, and he was pretty famous for this, a season pass holder, and rode it often a couple times a day. So he was someone that I think was the ideal, perhaps, of our theme park. Most guests wouldn't be that, feverishly focused on riding one ride that many times. But if you could use his example as an ideal, you could think about at the pinnacle of the theme park experience or the themed experience, you would have someone who would be that focused on the theme park such that he'd want to come there almost every day of his life. And so I think that's kind of the ideal to consider. I focus then on the notion of inclusive design and how design can be so inclusive that it will consider the needs of all guests, and it will also focus on the idea of creating important traditions within this space. Tradition is the next topic, and in this sense I talk about some different examples of how I think tradition might emerge in a space. And like most of these things we've talked about, it has to happen organically. It has to happen over time. You can't just snap your fingers and immediately have tradition in a space, quite obviously. But over time, if you create a sense of affinity with the guests, they feel like something connects with that space, and over time they come to appreciate it so much that they couldn't imagine living without the space. Like Flumy, they would be there every day or every month potentially, or at least when they come back they feel like, oh, I have to be back here because I have such an affinity to this particular space. The idea of inclusion, which we've talked about, the idea that they matter, they complete the story, they're a part of it. The idea of commitment, the idea that they're there and they're spending their money there, and so therefore they want to feel like the designer and the operators of the space have a commitment to them. So it's a relationship, a give and take relationship between the guest, the designers, the operators of that space. A sense of connection, the guest connects with their own life world and their experiences. And there's a sense of embeddedness such that you as a guest get so involved in this space that maybe over time you begin to become an aficionado on the internet. You take part in internet discussions, social networking sites. You, in the case of Disneyana with Disney memorabilia, you connect buttons or souvenirs from the place such that it becomes really a part of your life tradition. And what I really want to emphasize in writing this last chapter was how important this topic is I really believe, from what I've observed in my many years of experience in these industries, that when you see guests so excited about a space that they make it a part of their life, that's really the key dimension. That's the key thing to all the issues we've been talking about in all these chapters. So I really want to emphasize that. When we talk about tradition, we'll talk about extensions of the brand. We'll talk about some examples of how tradition can be developed in 5 or 6 different senses. I'll then focus on the idea of what I call a life space. And a life space is really an illustration of what I just talked about previously, and that's that idea that the space becomes so important to the guests that it's a part of their life, and hence I call it the life space. And many companies, many spaces are now involved in this, where You go home, but the space stays with you. So as a guest, there's something about the space that stays with you. You take it with you, you come back to it maybe in a virtual sense on the internet or through social networking, and then it's like a lifelong relationship that you develop, and we call this the life space. I then talk about new traditions developing, leading into forms of change. Change could include social change, it could be change as a result of cultural changes in your community. There are many examples of this that we can consider. We'll then wrap up with the idea of some concepts that won't ever change in a themed or designed space. For example, the guests will always have a desire to be entertained regardless of what that space is, and that entertainment should happen in new, exciting, and creative ways. The guest will always want to be want to feel like he or she is part of that space, not taken for granted in that space. The guest wants to be told compelling stories. The guest desires a variety of entertainment forms and story forms in that space. The guest would like to experience as many social connections as possible, whether with family, friends, or members, operators of that theme space. And the guest will always want to focus on the space at hand and have the desire to be charmed and to be part of a form of magic of that space. The chapter will also include interviews with Henry Jenkins, who's written a book called Convergence Culture, and he'll get into the idea of some of the cross-platform or cross-media applications that can be made when you're thinking about tradition, and also the famous architect Joel Bergman, principal of Bergman, Walls and Associates, who's designed many of the themed casinos that you see on the Las Vegas Strip, particularly those associated with the casino entrepreneur Steve Wynn. I then closed the chapter and closed the book with the idea of future stories, and the example here is Celebration Health and some of the efforts that they've made in developing creative spaces that are not just theme spaces, but are spaces that help people dealing with very difficult health issues, often life-threatening diseases and health issues that certainly are difficult to deal with regardless of the kind of space you're in, whether it's a functional space or a theme space. But the point I make about these future stories is that you have the opportunity as a designer not just to develop a space that's going to be exciting and tell a great story and maybe sell a brand or product or two, but really has the opportunity inherently to tell a story that could change a person's life. And that's really, again, the opportunity I think all designers have in terms of changing people's lives in these themed and immersive spaces. Thanks, and I hope you'll have the opportunity to come back and participate in some of the future discussions, a lot of the social networking sites I have featured on the website, and also watch some additional videos. Thanks for your time, and good luck.